Okay, so let's get started. Welcome. I'm Mary Davis Fournier. I'm the Deputy Director of the ALA Public Programs Office, and Libraries Transforming Communities Models for Change is an ALA initiative in partnership with the National Coalition for Dialogue and Deliberation. ALA is immensely grateful for funding support from the Institute of Museum and Library Services. Without their support, this work simply would not be possible. We'd also like to thank the Public Library Association for its partnership in this initiative. Models for Change is a 2-year professional development project that gives library workers access to free training in community leadership techniques, such as coalition building and dialogue facilitation. We hope that prior to the start of this webinar, you just took a few minutes to complete our pre-survey. It requested some information on your level of familiarity and experience with community engagement. Thank you so much for your responses. And at the end of this webinar, a quick post-survey will pop up. Please respond to it. Most of our learning opportunities for this project are being delivered via webinar, and it's just essential we receive your feedback to best serve you and your learning needs and adjust that as we go along. So thank you in advance. LTC Models for Change, and this is a project that gives library workers access to this free training. And the image you see on screen lays out the learning schedule for this series. This, as you can see, is the second webinar in this series targeted at mid-sized, small, and rural libraries. You may note that we have a, to the right, you see a pre-conference that is scheduled to take place at the ALA annual conference. Just an update, that is full at this moment, but there is a waiting list. So if you would like to register to get on that waiting list, Samantha will be posting that link in the chat on the right-hand side. In addition to the 3 webinars in this series, you may wish to check out the 2 previous series for larger and urban public libraries and for academic libraries. We've received consistent feedback that they have been helpful and accessed by library workers from many different types of libraries over the last few months. Now, before I introduce today's presenters, I'd like to say just a bit about how Future Search fits into the array of dialogue and deliberation models that we have been presenting for potential use in the library field in Models for Change. Many of the previous approaches have been specific to facilitation. During the course of the Models for Change series project, we've heard from so many library workers that community conversation leads so often to visioning for the future, whether that be strategic planning for the library or collaborative and collective imagining by community members who've never found themselves together in that space before. The Future Search approach is particularly suited to bringing diverse perspectives together through its broad approach to systems change, and its lens is one of making collaborative action, conflict transformation, and decision-making. It allows an entire group to bring dialogue important in situations where everyone needs to have the same large picture. So in this series for libraries serving mid-sized, small, and rural communities, we're going from macro to micro, from an intensive systems change approach with Future Search to a specific small group facilitation model with the next webinar on May 23rd, Conversation Cafe. So during today's webinar, Sandra Janoff and Jerry Gorlick will share some of their experiences internationally with Future Search in small villages in Africa and broad systems in Europe, and in the United States shaping the planning for Drexel University libraries and in a number of other sectors. So as you contemplate the connection between the global examples you'll hear in the next hour and your community, please think about contexts where you may want to bring everyone together in town or in the library, in your community for a more intensive process. And by the end of this webinar, we're hoping that you will understand possible applications of the Future Search approach to large issues, planning, and systems change for your community, be it large or small, urban or suburban or rural. So I'm pleased with that to be able to introduce our presenters today. Dr. Sandra Janoff is not only expert, but she is a co-founder and developer of FutureSearch. This process used worldwide to get the whole system focusing on the future and creating values-based action strategies. Sandra works with organizations and communities around the world on such issues as finding a future for the children of South Sudan during the North-South Sudanese Civil War. She's worked with numerous communities and networks in the U.S. on a variety of social issues, ranging from child poverty in Rochester, reentry in Massachusetts, statewide correction strategies in Nebraska, Washington, Massachusetts, and Virginia, and a national agenda for civil rights in the 21st century, and a shared agenda among all providers for home birth. Sandra is the co-author of FutureSearch, getting the whole system in the room for vision, commitment, and action. And as director of the FutureSearch Network, Sandra fosters a global community of members creating collaborative planning opportunities in every sector of society. And perhaps particularly relevant to libraries, FutureSearch Network's mission is to provide support for whatever people and institutions can afford. Sandra was also recently honored and received the Organization Development Network's 2016 Lifetime Achievement Award. Sandra's co-presenter, Jerry Gorlick, has devoted himself to helping organizational systems face their challenging questions and create conditions for sustained, successful strategic change. His clients come from a broad array of sectors and industries, including healthcare, education, insurance, publishing, manufacturing, and retail. And they represent a broad range of organizational structures: business, government, non-for-profit, faith communities. Prior to establishing his consulting practice, Jerry held senior positions for over 20 years in several successful healthcare organizations. We're also joined by Courtney Breeze, the National Coalition for Dialogue and Deliberation's wonderful managing director, Courtney has been our key thinking partner in this initiative, and she will be lending her depth of experience with LTC and professional facilitation skills to add expertise to our learning session today. So thank you all for being with us. I'm going to, with that, pass the microphone over to Sandra, who will get us started.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Mary, Courtney, ALA, and to all of you out there for being the caretakers of the most important meeting places in every community, lucky enough to have a library. Jerry and I are really honored that you showed up and want to talk about FutureSearch. I want to comment on the paradox of this webinar because we're going to be talking about a method, a theory, and philosophy that's best experienced face-to-face with large, diverse groups. And here we are throwing this into cyberspace where we'll have minimal interaction. So this is a great experiment in doing the best we can with what we have, and I'm tickled to see how this goes. As a way into this conversation, let me answer the question that we are always asked, which is, what exactly is FutureSearch? And can you give us the short version? Well, the answer to what is FutureSearch is tricky because it's easier to experience than describe. But I'd like to ask you a question. Is there anyone out there who has either been in a FutureSearch or knows of a FutureSearch application? Can you raise your hand on that little hand flag?
Yes, and folks, this is Courtney from NCDD. It's on your right-hand side in your participants box. If you haven't found it already, just go ahead and raise your hand. And Sandra, they're still coming in, but so far of the 128 of us in the room today, it looks like only about 4 have raised their hands.
This is amazing. Good. Okay. We have blank slates here. Let's see how we do. We think of future search in 3 ways. I'm going to read this with you. Future search is a non-traditional way of doing strategic planning that brings diverse stakeholders together in a meeting where there's a great deal of dialogue and learning and the discovery of a shared vision, action agenda, and a commitment to implementation. A short version would really be it's a principle-based meeting method. But we say more about future search. We also say future search is a theory, a philosophy, and a practice of facilitation where we create conditions for people to do what they aspire to while using the skills and capabilities they already have without having to be trained in advance. And third, we say future search is a way to make the world a more just and livable place, one meeting at a time. And the reason we could say this, the Future Search is a global strategy, is because I direct Future Search Network, which is an international network of practitioners and leaders where we apply future search principles in communities and organizations around the world for whatever people can afford. But here's what we'd like us to focus on today. I'd like to start by giving you an idea of the breadth of future search topics. So I'll share some of the sectors and issues where we've applied future search since the early 1990s. Then we could talk about the evolution of organizational and community change that brought us to this way of working. I want to share with you the principles of future search, the methodology, and then where future search has been applied in libraries. Here are some of the future searches that network members have run. And you'll see these are really complex problems that often go unresolved for years and decades. And there are more around the world, and we've been in practically every sector. And we say that with both humility and pride. Let me read this off. A future search has helped a community or helped organizations build a shared vision for a sustainable organization, integrated services for fragmented library system, a citywide affordable housing plan, addressing hunger in children, creating safety in schools, ending homelessness, partnerships among agencies and communities. These are just the 8 or 9 to be specific, but there are many more on the Future Search Net website under in that link that you can see. I'm wondering, do any of these resonate? And my question to you would be, what are you hearing that needs action in your community, if we can gather some of those thoughts or responses?
Yes, and you're welcome to enter those into the chat. While you do that, I would certainly just echo that from NCDD's experience working on this LTC Models for Change initiative. What I see here, Sandra, in terms of sectors, certainly resonates. And here we go. We've got some folks jumping in, serving the homeless. That's certainly something we've heard plenty about in our prior webinars as well. Tackling the opioid crisis is another comment. Revitalization of town. Creating a climate sustainability plan for our community and region. And I can go on. Some hunger in children, insufficient reading preparedness, drugs, and civic involvement. A whole lot there coming from Patty Mayfield. Thank you. Another downtown revitalization. So it sounds like revitalization issues like housing and hunger and more are some of the matters that the libraries are hearing about in their communities.
This is stimulating for us too, because these are the issues that where future search is an appropriate application, because these are complex problems that need the dialogue amongst the many participants, the diverse stakeholders, and often there aren't opportunities for people to come together, but when they do, and when people learn together about what the issues are and what their connection is to others, really important things can happen. So we see Future Search as a container where people work with the knowledge and experience they already have and make significant changes in the world where we are just faced with nonstop change, increasing diversity, political turbulence. Future Search isn't culture-bound. It's a meeting, but it's a special kind of meeting. And I want to share a quote from a client that really had an important impact on me and on all of us who do this work. His name is Ralph Carrier, and he was a UNICEF regional director concerned with improving education for Indonesian school children, and he ran a Future Search sponsored by government ministries that brought a diverse group of stakeholders together, including the children, to create a plan to decentralize secondary schooling. And he opened the meeting with these words, and I want to read them with you. He said, "Considering how much time and resources we spend in meetings, it should shock us that we don't get more important work done. Meetings are where we confront and resolve the problems and issues that society faces. And if we can't transform our ability to act in meetings, how can we expect transformation in society?" And whenever I share this, when I'm working with a group of people, whether we are learning together or it's a meeting to tackle some of these issues, people nod their heads. And I don't know if your heads are nodding about what it means to have meetings where we really can have an impact and achieve some of the outcomes that we hope for. But the meaning for me, I do want to add that Ralph went on, the meeting that he initiated went on to lead 40 interactive meetings around the country that put local education in the hands of the communities. So back to the essence of this work, my mission and those in the network is running meetings that matter. Here are more pictures of people meeting together in communities. It makes me smile because I remember being there. So just to show you a couple of pictures, some of them are in Uganda, some of them China, etc., just meetings around the world. But I'd like to talk now about what I know about the different ways people have been thinking about systems change since the beginning of last century. And I'd like to start by asking you a question. And if you could type in your responses again. And the question's this. If we're talking about change, if we're really wanting things to be different in our communities around the social issues that are important to us, what are our assumptions about change, and how can we have an impact that removes us from the cynicism of always gathering and not accomplishing what we want? So here's the starter question. How do people think about systems change when you first started working in your library system?
Excellent. So we've got folks starting to chime in already. SWOT is the very first thing that was mentioned, so it's SWOT analysis. A couple of comments about change being hard or people being resistant to change. Yeah. Actually, Jerry here wrote impossible. So the extreme of resistance to change, perhaps. Several people have chimed in with the phrase, if it ain't broke.
Oh.
Old habits are hard to break. And if I can just grab one more here, it just escaped me, but I thought it was pretty good. Change not being in the hands of the everyday worker, but only the big boss.
Well, that's a good transition to what I want to share with you. And Courtney, thank you so much for being my partner in this.
Sure.
Let me tell you about the 4 ways that I know to go about improving how we work, and how that's evolved over the last 100 years. So this is a little history lesson, but the thing that's always been important to me in sharing this is that it gives us an understanding of how we've thought about change in organizations or in communities and its evolution. And this is called the learning curve. It was formulated by Marv Weisbord, who's my business partner. He's now retired. But what it says is that the way you go about influencing change is based on the assumptions that you hold about change. So I'm going to describe each one of these positions. Here, we have one way to think about change is to have an expert tell you what to do to solve each of your problems, because there are experts for every problem. So get an expert. If you have a really complex problem, you get 20 experts and let each one tell you how they would fix their part of the problem. And little metaphor, it's like taking a carburetor from a Mercedes, adding it to an engine from a Nissan, getting a perfect set of tires somewhere else, the perfect exhaust system from another car, and putting them all together and expecting that you'll have a superior car. That's the expert way to do it. And because you are doing each part of a fragmented system with the very best technical capability that you can find, the assumption is that if you put it all together, it would be better than anyone has ever done before. And that's what's called expert problem solving. This was the only form of workplace improvement in the first half of the 1900s, because after the Industrial Revolution, work was mainly assembly line and mass production. Experts were the technical fixers, and the unit of change was the individual problem, and people were pairs of hands. Now, while people, some of you maybe are nodding your heads because we all know what assembly line work means and what the implications are, we still use that mode of changing or fixing by saying there's an expert for the problem and let's reduce the issues down to a single problem. But here's how the evolution or the understanding of change evolved over the next couple decades. And I'm going to then go to the next position, which is this way of doing change evolved through what's called group problem solving in the mid-1900s. I don't know if this will be familiar to you, but this happened when the social scientist named Kurt Lewin, who actually is the father of all of the work that we do involving any social systems, when Kurt Lewin pointed out that people are more committed to the solutions that they've had a hand in creating. I think this may sound familiar to many of you. So group problem solving is where people sit in groups and brainstorm problems and figure out how to solve them. This is a really big shift from experts being the only one with the answers to involving people in finding solutions. But they were still focused on their own problems and working in discrete groups. For example, the schools are solving their problems over here, the churches over here, healthcare people are working on theirs over there, government over there, and each of them comes up with their solutions for transforming their community that they want to implement. But when they try to implement it, they run into the people from other groups who have contrary ideas. I hope there's some resonance here. And I will I will talk about how this is not to exclude any one of these ways of thinking about change, but what's appropriate when. So I'm going to go to the next position, which is a big shift from problem solving into thinking about what we now know as open systems. And it wasn't until the 1970s that open systems thinking would be appreciated in the social scientists. sciences, because originally this was a concept that was understood in biology. Ludwig von Bertalanffy, I don't know if that name means anything to any of you, but he was a biologist who really, very simply to state, but radical if acted on, he said, all things are linked up with one another and influence one another. Everything is connected to everything. This was a brand new concept in the physical world, the biologic world, and in the social scientists in the second half of last century. So now people started talking about systems and recognizing that systems, organizational systems or community systems, have to be open to their environment that they live in order to renew and thrive, which means interacting with other systems rather than living in silos. So with this understanding, the third, I gave you the slide that I'm about to talk to next. The third way is to get some really good systems thinkers on the job. You can get consultants with a holistic view of the entire system to tell you where the leverage points are and how to really work those leverage points. But of course, implementation is entirely up to you, even though the ideas may be very sound. And the last thing, which is the slide I jumped to, probably with my excitement about what it means to live in this quadrant of the learning curve. This is the strategy that I've been experimenting with for the last 25 years and those who do this work. And it's the idea of getting everybody involved in improving the whole system. And that's what I'd like to talk to you about. What does it mean to get everybody improving the whole system? And I just want to refer back to the many issues that you named when we asked where the resonance is around what it means to apply a model where we are bringing diverse stakeholders together. The complexity of those issues really do call for a different way of working. If we were all in the same room, I would ask you, how's this going? Is this making sense? Any comments? Are we together on this? Because the question that we really do have to ask ourselves is, what does it mean to get everybody improving the whole system? And what I want to say is that, for one thing, you really can't hope to improve a whole system if you don't understand how it works. And you can't hope to understand how it works unless you could see it through the eyes of other people who are working in that system and actually have that understanding, because every person in any community is an expert on their own piece of the system, and they know things that no other human being in the community knows. But very often they don't get the opportunity to utilize what they already know. So people need to understand not only how things work, but how their own piece affects the whole. So I'm going back to the whole image of the learning curve. I want to emphasize that these are not mutually exclusive positions. They're additive. And the meaning of the learning curve is the idea that if we have increasingly learned to improve, problem solving by having it become more participative, and how to improve systems thinking by having people learn to think about all the moving parts. So our objective is to get everybody to work as systems thinkers without actually having to be systems thinkers. So if you believe what I'm saying, that the strategy we should be embracing if we're really trying to make the world better and make communities better and make libraries better and more relevant, is to get everybody, experts included, working in such a way that what they do contributes to the betterment of the whole. Because if you can get the whole system in the room to learn together and act together, something magical happens that no expert can make happen and no amount of problem solving can make happen. So, for a short pause, I'd like to tell you a story. It's not a library example. We'll get to that. And it isn't even a U.S. example, but there are themes in this story that may be relevant to what you deal with in your communities. So I'm about to launch into a story that is very important to me. It was a formative experience for me in my professional world and my work. And it's titled The Future Search for the Children of Southern Sudan. In 1999, I got a call from Sharad Sapra, pictured here, who was director of UNICEF's Operation Lifeline Sudan. The North and South were in the midst of a 17-year civil war, and a whole generation of children were suffering. There were no schools, no medical care. Families were being torn apart, and some of the children had been forced to serve as soldiers. Sapra said he could do nothing about the peace in the region, but he could do something for the children. I will never forget that phone call. He wanted to hold 2 future searches, one for the children and the second where the children would join the adults. That was his concept, by the way, and I thought it was brilliant. He said he could bring all the stakeholders from inside and outside to Sudan to a hotel conference room in Nairobi, Kenya. There are the children in their villages, and then you'll see the children when they finally came to Nairobi. He said that they would have that if he could bring these stakeholders together, and they'd have to face the fact that the children had no future unless they decided to do something about it. Thinking of, this complex problem, what do we do to create a future for children who have no future? How do we do that together? And he understood that it could only be done if he brought all of the stakeholders together. He offered me the challenge, and I accepted. And I often say this. The truth is, I said yes before I even knew where Sudan was. I mean, I knew it was in Africa, but I couldn't have pinpointed it on the map. Now I can. I first met the children briefly when they arrived at the hotel. They had been transported from their villages across Sudan, and it was their first time out of South Sudan, and there they were trying to figure out bathtubs with running water, telephones, televisions, and of course they didn't know what to make of this thing called Future Search that they'd been invited to. But after a day of rest and meals, good food, and they were given these sweatshirts, some fresh clothing to wear, we gathered for the first Future Search. And it started with me sitting in a circle with 40 children aged 12 to 18 from diverse tribes. Now, the truth is, I did not know how to begin. Even though I'd thought about it all night, I was really as stupefied at that moment as any of the children. I had experiences in numerous cultures, but I had no idea what I was going to say to these young people. I knew that my opening sentence, my typical beginning statement to a meeting like this is to say, let me tell you how this meeting is different from other meetings that you've attended. I knew that wouldn't work. I looked around, I looked into the eyes of these children who were looking at me. And I found these words coming up from inside of me. And I said to them, you are the future of your country, and your voice is important. And then I paused. And at that moment, something occurred to me. I felt that I'd said something meaningful, but the children around the circle spoke 6 languages, and it occurred to me there wasn't even a guarantee that those who spoke English would understood me. So I added, please raise your hand if you understood what I just said. 3 hands went up. So I repeated. Do you see? This takes me right back. You could see one of the young girls whose hand is up. So I repeated it. I said, you're the future of your country. Your voices are important. And they were still staring at me. So I asked the translators, please translate to each child and ask the children to tell each other what I said using their own words. And instead of staring at me, they moved around, getting closer to their translators, closer to each other. And as the children were explaining this to each other and to me, what it meant, I kept adding, you are the future of your country. Your voice is important. Please raise your hand when you understand. And I seriously don't remember how long it took. It was close to a half hour. I was repeating the sentence many times. The children were filled with energy talking to each other. And finally, all the hands were raised. Everyone in the circle was involved. And in that short time, something changed in me, because I watched these children come alive as they were making meaning of the one sentence that I had been saying. And though I had come with minimal expectations about our ability to build a community, I still was not prepared for the obvious. You never know when you really understood, and here we were at the beginning of this future search, creating conditions to help each other really understand. This was simple and profound at the same time. The children agreed to a rule in the meeting. We would all make sure that everyone understood what we were saying as we moved along, no matter how long it took. So I learned so many lessons. First of all, the young people get it. Here they are in the future search, talking to each other, sharing. They shared stories. They built a vision for their future. They made decisions together about who would go to the adult conference and how they would take their vision to the adult conference. And 4 days later, I had another, what do I do now, when I started the second future search. Sharad Sapra again was opening the meeting of the 80 adults along with the children. From the first, we're sitting and ready to begin this 3-day meeting. And then all of a sudden, and this happened to me to my absolute surprise, there were tears running down my face. I had bonded with these children. And I walked outside and looked up and I said, this has got to work. But then, of course, I had to collect myself and reclaim my role. And when I went back to the meeting, I knew I had to let go of another phrase that I had been using over the years. I was accustomed to saying to participants, even though we can't predict the outcomes, by the 3rd day, you will discover your common ground agenda on which to take action. In this case, the adults in the room included members of 2 tribes that were at war with one another. And I found myself saying, we have an opportunity to find out if there is a common ground agenda for the future of the children. Now, this may not sound as significant as it felt, but I really had to let go of any control I believed or wished I'd had. I prayed that they would agree on a way forward for the children, who after 3 days were in my heart. But I knew that, and this is important, I knew we had planned these meetings very carefully and had created the right conditions for this complex task. But change happens one step at a time, and it's not up to me or any of us to make it happen. The participants had to decide what they would do each step of the way. I want to add something. 10 years later, Marv Weissport and I wrote a chapter in our book on facilitation titled Control What You Can and Let Go What You Can't. And that's what this meeting is about. Controlling what you can't control, controlling what you can control in order to create the conditions for people to discover what it is that they want to do together. I just want to say that this meeting had the outcomes I'd hoped for, but it wasn't easy. There was a moment when the tempers flared between tribal chiefs about land rights issues that came up. And this was another important moment of not knowing, because the tension rose, and I knew that I had to bring some reality to this, and all I could do was offer them a choice. Did they want to spend this meeting on the conflicts that could not be resolved here, or did they want to focus on the future for their children? They couldn't do both in the time that we had. And more important, the children were in the room, and they were hearing what they had to say, and the right adults were in that room doing the right adults that could do something constructive for the children. People from within South Sudan, as well as Sudanese diaspora, that included teachers, expatriate business people, healthcare workers, elders, chiefs, women from the villages, social service agency people, academics, funders, and the children themselves, and I emphasize that. The adults who were in the struggle chose to step out of the fight and keep working for the kids. And the meeting ended with very concrete plans for instructional materials for the teachers, building schools, getting books into the country, and bringing health services to the villages. And a year later, a second future search was held inside South Sudan on demobilizing the child soldiers. And over the next year, 13,000 young boys were sent back to their villages. So, again, I wish we were all in the same room, but I will tell, the question is always, what does this story mean to each of us? But what this story means to me in this crazy time that we're living in is that around the planet, people are putting enormous energy into warring over differences, fighting over differences, attacking over differences. And imagine if they discovered that if they discovered that there are things that they could agree on and work on together. And this is true whether we're talking about the issue of children who have been brought into an army in the middle of war, or children who are hungry in any one of our, hungry or in need in any one of our cities in the United States. I want to say that the moment that the tribal chiefs stopped shouting at each other and turned their attention to the children was a heart-stopper. But in future search, there's no shortage of heart-stopping moments, because people often find themselves at a fork in the road. The one path replays the fight. We all know how to have the fight. But the other path is unknown territory, and which is working together on some aspiration that they discover they actually share. So with deep respect for how difficult it is, I offer the choice, because walking into the unknown, tackling an issue in a way that both makes us vulnerable but also speaks to the courage that many of us do have when the conditions are right. It takes the kind of courage that I have, and I think we all have, the utmost respect for, because the problems that we face, the social and the economic, even our technical and political problems, are enormous. So I cannot wait to get some reactions, but I hope you're all with me, because before I get some reactions to this, I'd like to tell you the 4 future search principles that guide everything that I and my colleagues do. And here we begin. The first principle, and I have been talking a lot about this, and it's getting the whole system in the room. I want to emphasize a few more things. It's the idea that if we want people to really understand and take responsibility for the system they work in, they need to experience it for themselves. They don't get it from presentations or reports. People have to be present to one another. In order for a system to change, people have to be able to interact with people who are part of their environment and key to their success. Because when the same people talk to each other, we only perpetuate the kind of conditions that we're trying to get out from under. I hope this resonates with you. The biggest frustration in meetings, and the reason why people are cynical, is not because of who's present, but because of who's missing. So we assure that we have the whole system, and by that we mean people with authority, resources, expertise, information, and need, meaning those who will be impacted by the outcome, that collectively we have this cast of characters, and when we get these people together, everyone in the room will understand the issues at a level that none understood before. And when you get that level of understanding into the system, people are capable of action that they never were before. So that's the first. But the second principle is what happens when they're together, and we call it exploring the whole elephant before acting on a part. And that is about enabling people to understand the system in new ways that are based on reality and not on the assumptions they carry in their head. And I hope, and I'll almost say I'm sure many of you know the story of the blind man and the elephant. It's a great Sufi tale. It's about 6 blind men who go out to see what an elephant's like. They fall into the elephant and start describing it. And the man who's, I love this cartoon, the man who's grabbed the leg, he says, aha, an elephant is like a tree. And the man who's got the trunk that's squiggling around, no, 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 an elephant is like a snake. But then there's the guy at the end, and he's got the tail. He says, you are both wrong, an elephant's like a rope. And the guy at the ear says, to me, an elephant is like a fan. And the guy who's fallen against the side of the elephant says it's like a wall. And the guy who's at the tusk and touching the tip says, no, 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 an elephant's like a spear. Now, I think many of you may know this is written as a poem, and it's on the internet. The end of the poem goes like this. They argued loud and strong because while each was in the right, they were all in the wrong. And whenever I tell that story, people's heads are nodding. And I hope some of you out there are nodding your heads because, in fact, we all believe that the nature of the whole issue is just a larger version of our part. But in fact, the nature of the beast is more complex, and the opportunity we have in Future Search is to put the parts together and learn about the reality of and the complexity of this elephant before we go into action. Hope this is making sense, everyone. I'm going to describe the third principle, and it's putting the problems and conflicts in the background and the focus of what people are ready, willing, and able to do in the foreground. And that means we put common ground in the foreground. It doesn't mean that we push anything under the rug, conflicts and problems or valid information. People can bring up anything they want, but the rule of this game is that the differences do not have to be resolved. The conflicts do not have to be negotiated for there to be an action agenda. It's that 80-20 rule. Instead of spending 80% of our time on the 20% of the issues that we don't agree on, we don't have to negotiate our differences. We're really asking, what is it that people want, what is their shared aspiration? What is it that people want to make happen? Where are we already aligned? So we move from asking what went wrong and how do we fix it to what do you want to do and who wants to work together to make it happen? And the fourth principle has to do with people taking responsibility for themselves and the action they're ready to take. So we set things up so that people can make their own discoveries, cross the boundaries that previously kept them apart, decide what they want to do, discover that there is a shared agenda, if there is. If you remember back to what I really said in the beginning of the conference with the adults and children in Sudan, if there is a shared agenda, they will discover what that is and how they can collaborate going forward. So this is where I've been able to discover leverage, and those who work with me in the network or those who get these principles and apply them to any of their meetings. And I really believe this. One person can't change a whole system. I don't know anyone who can. They're just too big. They're too diverse. The power's too widely distributed. But in every meeting, if the conditions are right, there's a chance to do something that people never did before. And we have an opportunity to give people in a room, when we get the right, the whole system together, we have an opportunity to give people a chance to do something that they never did before, because collectively we know everything. I'm taking a breath. I assume you are too. I can't imagine just listening to me, and I hope it's working for you. Before we pause and have conversation, it was, we decided that you probably really want to know about the methodology. So this last piece of input to you is a description of the future search methodology. So let me say this. Let's say our task is the future of a community's public library. There are 5 phases in this meeting: past, present, future, common ground, and action. The important feature here is that everyone in the room is working on the same task. So we begin with everybody participating in a review of the history of the task itself. And here, let's say, the history of the library system, or the community, or the issue, in the context of what's happening in the world, and in the community, and in people's personal experience. People learn together how the critical events of the past have contributed to where we are now. And at the end of the first day, people build a map together of the social, political, and economic trends in the environment that are having an impact on, in this case, I'm saying the library system. Now again, everyone is participating in an analysis of all the trends in society and what it is that they, individually or collectively, are doing about those trends, and what they want to do that they are not doing. We get people out of the problem-solving mode to experience themselves in a much larger context. They share a lot of information about what's going on that some people have, but not everybody has. And then we get them talking about how they feel about what they're doing. What are they proud of, and what are they sorry about where things have not gone as well as they would have liked? And this isn't about finger-pointing or blaming or moaning or groaning. It's really about owning up and taking responsibility. And after that, we ask people to put themselves into the future and ask, what is this system, what is this library system like maybe 10 years from now, far enough in the future that they don't say this is impossible to do. And we ask them to dramatize that future, to think about policies, relationships, programs, and imagine them as concretely as possible, and dramatize them as if they're happening right now. And then we ask people to figure out what are the propositions that everyone in this room would agree to. This is something that they cannot know until they've had these experiences together. But it's very easy after they've looked at the past, present, and future together to say, these are the things we really agree on, whatever our differences. This is where we're in agreement. So we have them write up their agreements, and then based on those propositions that they agree to, which is their common ground agenda, we ask them to take the ones they want to make concrete and action plan and translate into real program, policy, and practice. And then see who wants to work with whom to make these things come alive in the community. And by the time they go out, they're pretty clear about what they want to do and who they're going to do it with. They've made commitments to each other, and the chances for implementation are pretty assured. So, I am pausing. Courtney?
Yes. Thank you, Sandra.
And I am taking a drink of water, and I am so grateful to whatever that I didn't cough your ears off, because I have the lingering cough from a cold. But I have a big smile on my face. I wish I could see all of you. Courtney, take it away.
Absolutely. My pleasure, Sandra. And thank you for sharing all of that. I just want to say that I know earlier on you had kind of asked folks if they were with you, and at the time you got a resounding yes, but there's been a couple of moments since then where you've been, I hope you're with us. So let's just take a brief moment to touch, to check in here. So, you've heard from Sandra a real in-depth story about, impacting a whole system in South Sudan, which included both the small villages as well as the whole education system. And then you heard a bit about the principles and the methodology of this future search. So, just checking in for a moment, if you can briefly share with us in the chat, can you see the work that you are facing in your community fitting into this context? And that can just be a quick yes or no. And a second question to that, I'm seeing a yes already, that's great. A couple yeses, awesome. Oh, good. So far, a resounding group of yeses, Sandra. So they're with you, and they can see it. That's amazing. A second question. Sorry, Sandra.
No, I'm thrilled, just thrilled.
Excellent. And I just want to highlight, Hope just chimed in with small rural communities are perfect for this. I would absolutely agree, and that's one of the reasons why NCDD wanted to introduce our small, mid-sized, and rural libraries to this process. And Erin also chimed in with, although the time commitment is challenging, and I think we can recognize that, and perhaps we can talk a little bit more about that when we get to the Q&A time. A second question, if you want to reflect for a moment, and perhaps I can call out one or two, and then we're going to move on to Jerry's presentation because I want him to share his experience working in a library setting. But, what might this look like for your community? So if you have any thoughts as you've been listening to Sandra and looking at the methodology, and certainly we've talked about topics and issues that would be your communities need to really come together as a whole system and talk about what might it look like. What's your thinking on that so far? So feel free to share that with us in the chat. Like I said, maybe I can call out one or two right now, and then we can always go back when we get to the end of the presentation. So feel free to share that with us. Okay, and some questions are starting to pop in, which is great, and we'll get to those shortly. So thank you, Robin, and others who have shared those with us. We are keeping an eye on those. All right. we've got a couple folks chiming in. So Charlotte just said, I see it as being helpful with internal staff teams, et cetera. Certainly, and you know, I think Sandra would echo that. Certainly when you're talking about the whole system of the library, it's something that could be useful to you in that way, not to mention, of course, in your whole community with some of those trickier issues that impact the entire community. I just want to highlight Amy, and then we're going to move on to Jerry. Amy Grasmick just chimed in with, I've been looking for some other person to take the lead in getting community organizations in the room to work on common goals. I guess that person can be me. And I think, Sandra, that's been one of your key points, is absolutely that person can be you.
Yeah, and I know that time is an issue here. There was one other comment that I thought was so important. I think the whole system at the table ID, we typically omit the people we want the main goal to serve. These insights, these awarenesses are so important. And if this stimulates your thinking, we have just begun. There's so many conversations to have about how you go from what people are comfortable with, used to, how you really cross that bridge to do things that are way out of many of even our comfort zone. Yes, the time is how do we get people together for that stretch of time, but more, how do we get this diversity together in the room? So these are not barriers. These are problems to solve and conversations to have. So I love that you're asking these questions.
Me too.
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to Jerry now so that he can tell us about his experience in feature search in a library setting.
Great. Thank you, Courtney, and thanks, Sandra. I'm delighted to be with you, and not just to be talking about future search, but to be speaking to you in libraries that have, in many ways, unique positions in your communities to pull people together and to convene conversations. We want to tell you right now about one particular application of future search in a library setting, and I expect this will be an interesting case in its own right, and I think it also illustrates features of future search that I expect can apply to a whole range of other library settings and purposes beyond this particular case. This is the story of the Future Search Conference sponsored by the libraries of Drexel University in July of 2011. And you see on this slide some metrics of the library at the time that the Future Search was getting organized and conducted. And I just want to point out two things, particularly here. The second bullet, Drexel, in addition to having a traditional college campus library spanning the schools of engineering and business and general science, humanities, and social science, also has separate libraries and separate campuses, in some cases for the medical school, for nursing and health sciences and law school. So it's a complex enterprise even within the university itself. And in the last bullet, I want to give you a little bit of the backstory to the Future Search. So Dean of Libraries, Danuta Nateki, arrived to Drexel in 2010. And soon thereafter, a new university president was installed, John Fry. And President Fry launched a university-wide strategic planning effort. And Danuta, the Dean of Libraries, noticed that there was no explicit mention of libraries in the university's vision or directions. And yet there was recognition among some administrative staff and beyond in the university that the libraries represented some unmet potential for not just themselves, but for the university. In one instance that was in the recent past at that time was a space assessment exercise that had been conducted in which the libraries began to redefine itself as a learning enterprise that could partner with other elements of the university community in order to advance Drexel's overall mission and go beyond the expected service role of maintaining study spaces and collections and really see itself and have the university at large see it as a learning enterprise. So within a year, Dean Natecki was encouraged to develop a plan to transform the library that, in a way that would complement the overall university's emerging strategic plan. Although President Fry really had no preconceived idea of the library, it indicated that the plan should emerge from the planning process itself. And Danuta, the dean, was really focused on evolving a vision through engagement of multiple constituents rather than something that would be imposed, a vision that would be developed from the top. And she recognized, as she related to me, having a list of the right ideas would be insufficient as a result of any work that our collaboration might produce. She felt the need to establish that any such list of ideas had validity across a range of stakeholder views. And she also considered it essential to somehow identify an interactive setting where energy for engaging with these ideas might be found. And so in the end, she selected Future Search as the method of choice in order to engage a large group of stakeholders to both envision the library's future and to begin to spark the organizational changes that might be needed to bring about that future. So the libraries as a unit established a scope and purpose of its Future Search as a preliminary launch. And as you see in this slide, helping to establish the library vision and direction in service to the university's overall vision and direction. And there are several bullets here, and I want to just elaborate a bit on them. The key stakeholder groups actively engaging more than the usual group of library administrators, and discovering common ground in the ways that Sandra already identified in terms of the sequence and the methodology of Future Search, to discover in the meeting where there was common ground regarding the future of Drexel libraries that everybody present wanted, and then identifying first steps and creating conditions under which people could step into where they were willing to take accountability and apply energy to take actions. The stakeholder groups are these here. Some may be expected, some less so, and all together representing what was deemed to be the whole system, having the authority and resources and expertise and information and need as per Future Search principles. And just really quickly in the time available, I want to talk about the outcomes that came from the Future Search as reported by the libraries and the university back to us. And I can report these results with an additional measure of confidence than just anecdotal, in that a year after the Future Search, a journal, Library Leadership and Management, published an article on this particular conference's output and its impact on transforming the library. And through some interviews and surveys conducted by a researcher at the university not connected to the libraries, some of this was validated. And after being invited to this presentation, I reconnected with Dean Natecki after some years, had a conversation with her earlier this month. And one of the things she said is that when I asked her to kind of recap, 7 years later, she said, having all the diverse voices served us very well. As far as content of what came out of the Future Search, we really might not have come up with all of our strategic direction had we not taken that route. And even if we would have, acting just within the library alone, the Future Search certainly was valuable over and above the content of our ideas. It was actually a good illustration of the power that comes from having engaged other stakeholders. I'm quoting from my notes from my conversation with Dean Natecki here. We engaged some new players, and presenting our resulting plan to the senior administration at the university, the plan carried an extra level of credibility because it represented students, faculties, and others outside the library structure itself. She also spoke of the value of framing the question in the pre-work for the future search itself, and expressed the feeling that this framing the question is something fundamental that future search has in common with libraries and librarians. And I'll leave that to you to decide. But this is what I wanted to present from the case study, and I hope that this example, despite it being of an academic library setting and of a future search that happened to be focused on the institution itself, the sponsoring institution itself, that this helps to awaken the imaginations of those of you participating in today's call. It sounds like even earlier from the prompted chat that you've got ideas going where in relation to an issue or concern or transformational need of some system within your own community, you might want to consider a tool, a set of principles and a methodology such as future search that could actually help transform that system or address that systemic concern. So thank you for listening to this part of the presentation, and I think we're going to turn this over now to Sandra.
Thank you so much, Jerry, and I'm so conscious of time and so eager to see where this takes all of us. But, you know, final thought, I think we know these words, and let's say them again. Transforming a system means you have to start by doing something you've never done before. We all can say in our sleep, we could say Einstein's brilliant, I don't think it was a tweet. I think maybe he wrote it down, but he said if you've always done if you always do what you've always done, you always get what you always get. And so we have great empathy for anyone, any leader who has the courage to take a step and say, I don't know how I'm going to ask people for that time. I don't know how I'm going to get people who don't usually come to these kinds of meetings, but I'm willing to explore what it means for my system. So I just want to say I want to share that I do go into despair because I feel the world's more destabilized than ever. There are massive numbers of people without resources, many without hope. But what keeps me going personally is that I've learned that under the right conditions, people have been able to tackle intractable problems like the ones that you mentioned: hunger, homelessness, child abuse, housing, making breakthroughs in communities torn apart by racism, sectarianism, in economic inequity. I'm so grateful when people can find ways out of dark places, and I really have faith that we can do it. So, with that faith and belief and experience, we're going to take questions. I want to make sure that we do get to the last slide that you have if you've downloaded, which is what next steps you can take. And I want to repeat, the Future Search Network is there to support you. So, Courtney.
Great. Thank you, Jerry and Sandra. I know that we had one question earlier that if either of you could speak to, which was asking about how to get officials like your mayor or your city council or others involved in this process. So is there any help that you can, or guidance you can provide in that regard?
Yeah, the guidance that we could provide is that there's no easy answer to a question like this. And the experience that we have always had is that when we can get a planning group together, a small working group, about, let's say 8 is a round number, but people who understand the issue, we need a leader to start there, somebody who kind of steps up and says, either with the authority or with the influence, to say, I want to gather a small group of people together to explore what would it mean for us to have a future search, and who are the stakeholders that we would have to get into the room, and how do we do that? And over the years, and it's 25 years now, over the years, the creativity that emerges from a group of people who really want to make this happen is extraordinary. So, number one, is it an issue that is so important to people that that they've tried everything else, and this is the only way, this is an option that hasn't been tried. So number one, it's the task that really is the glue. People who care about the issue and understand that this is a real possibility to make something different happen. And I've seen people in this planning committee have one-on-one conversations with important people in their community about this. We've tried everything else. What are we going to do?
That's great. Sandra, I hate to cut you off, but another question popped in I'd really love to get your thoughts on, and we are running out of time. So Nicole chimed in and asked, what are examples of actionable items participants said they would do, and how were they held accountable? Maybe you can give us an example of that.
Yeah. People hold themselves accountable, and I don't mean that in a fluffy way, but one of the best insurances for sustaining the outcomes of a future search is to bring people back on a regular basis to say, here's what we're doing. We call it a review meeting. Here's what we're doing. Are we still in line with this agenda that we committed to? And reporting out, this is, here are the actions we committed to take, and here's what we do. Another mechanism is having a way of communicating what working groups are doing. If you're talking about a community, it's how you set up. And now we've got, so much creativity in social media or internet. The kind of, are we on track with the commitments that we've made? God, I'm so conscious of the time.
That's great, Sandra. I think we'll have to stick with some brief initial thoughts for now.
Oh, let me say this. Go to the website and read the case studies and the stories. You'll get some idea of how the outcomes are sustained.
Great. That is perfect. And I was going to say, if we can just, if Mary can just advance us to the next slide too, for folks, if your question is not answered today, this slide has information on where you can go to both get more information and ask some further questions, because some of what you've asked is fantastic, but I don't think we can do it fully justice in the time we have left. So I have some other questions. We can touch on at least one more. Sandra, how about Courtney asked how to get your staff to think as a whole system. Many staff think that's not my department of the library, so they don't take responsibility of the library as a whole system. So do you have any advice on how to get people starting to think of the whole system?
Yeah, I think you want to get them in the room together, get them around, what is the issue? Do a go-around. What is my part of the issue? What's my understanding of it? And have people learning from each other. Build a map of what we know, of what's happening in that world that's having an impact on us. Get people's understanding, contextual understanding. If you're talking about your staff in a library, look at your library in the context of the community or of the wider world. What are the trends? What is happening out there having an impact on us, and what are we doing now in response, and what are we not doing that we want to do? Help people think of your library system in that bigger context and learn together about what is happening and what their aspirations are that's not yet happening, and who do we need to be in conversation with in order to do something that's different.
Thank you. And I'm going to give us one more minute to squeeze in one last question. Karen asked, how do you get gatekeepers to open up to listening to the non-experts? To the non-experts?
Yeah. Well,
Go ahead.
Meaning
I believe she means, how do you get the decision makers to really open up the conversation to include, those who, other members of the community who may not necessarily have the decision-making authority but need to be a part of the solution.
Right. In this particular process that we built, the methodology, people are creating information based from like pools of information from the very beginning. So everyone is contributing to this big information base about where we've been. People are sitting in what we call mixed groups, not the experts in one group and those who are impacted in another group, but people are sitting in mixed groups and analyzing or understanding from the information on these timelines about what is the story that has brought us to this place, about who we are in this room, what's happened in the world, and what we know about the library. And when you begin in a flatter playing field, it's really pretty impressive that people are listening to one another because they are sharing their information and discovering that, we really all do live on the same planet, subject to the same forces, and we all have the same basic psychological need. And that sharing really enables people to discover that my reality and your reality is part of this shared reality, and that happens in a meeting like that. And the last thing is that's why it takes time. It doesn't happen overnight. That's why it's not a half of a day.
Absolutely. Thank you, Sandra. I'm going to turn things over now to Mary, who's going to close us out.
Thanks, Courtney, and thank you, everyone, for all of this, such a depth of knowledge and so many great questions that unfortunately we didn't have time for. We encourage you to reach out to us, though, and reach out to the folks at Future Search who are really excited about bringing this into the library field. We hope that you'll try this, you'll adapt it, you'll find more out, and you'll let us know about how it's going so that we all as a field will benefit from your experiences. And we hope you leave today's webinar feeling that you can use some of what you've learned today in your work. So thank you to our presenters, Dr. Sandra Janoff, Jerry Gorlick, and Courtney Breeze. Thank you as well to IMLS, PLA, ACRL, and our Models for Change Advisory Group for their guidance, as well as to my colleagues behind the scenes, Stephen Hoffman, Samantha Oakley, and Sarah Ostman, for their support of this webinar and for the library's Transforming Communities Models for Change initiative. This learning webinar has been a part of the ALA's Libraries Transforming Communities initiative, which addresses a critical need within the library field by developing and distributing tools and resources to support the work of engaging communities in innovative ways. Thank you all for taking this time with us today.